like you're representing Don here today. Don is at a funeral, not able to attend. So we want to go through our business items at the beginning. We want to welcome everyone out. We want to first of all ask if any questions or concerns on the minutes. Those were resent out with some minor adjustments yesterday. Are there any questions, concerns, or modifications that need to be made? If not, I'll take a motion to approve the minutes. Tom made that motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Second, thank you. Second by Dina. All in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed? We also have the agenda that we want to see if there's any modifications that people are suggesting to the agenda. Not that we can make them because it's been published and, can't add to it, but are there any modifications people want to make to it? If not, we'll go ahead and proceed with the agenda as outlined. Our first item is the activity update. This is from Laura, who's going to present the information to us today.
Yes, thanks, Leland. I'll start off talking about the Great Salt Lake Summit.
No, there were no questions really.
Had their staff out on the ground and ready to get up in the air, I believe, late last week. But a random algal bloom happened, and so the clarity of the water was significantly decreased and will likely be decreasing for the foreseeable future. So the decision was made to postpone the LiDAR flight until spring, so till May or June, well, early May, I think, which in the end, I think that is not a bad thing, because that's when folks are anticipating that the clarity would be at its finest anyway. So we'll be waiting till May to give you an update on the LiDAR project. And then the shorebird study, we are currently contracting. We have that out for contracting now, and the surveys will likely begin in April. So those are all of the advisory council updates I have, Leland.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Laura? If not, we'll proceed to the next item on the agenda. We have a presentation by the U.S. Geological Survey on the state of the lake equation study that they've been working on. So we'll turn the time over to you and have fun.
It's Paul. Angel Paul?
We'll have it on screen just a second.
Oh. All right. Can everybody hear me if I just talk at this level from the microphone? I usually get into fights with microphones and it's not good. So can you all hear me just fine? Great. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here. We're just going to jump right into this on this update on the Great Salt Lake Equation Estate. I think by the end of the presentation, you'll appreciate how important this equation is and how much convenience it lends to monitoring Great Salt Lake. So before we jump into it, this work was funded by the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council and with USGS cooperative matching funds. So thank you very much to the council. And also special thanks to the Brine Shrimp Co-op for assisting with us deploying our boat and retrieving our boat from Great Salt Lake. That's one of the only access points we have right now for this 23-foot boat of ours. So, and it's not an insignificant amount of help that they provide. That's their telehandler. So it interrupts their day. So we just very much appreciate the Brine Shrimp Co-op for helping us launch and retrieve our boat. So we're going to just talk briefly about what the Great Salt Lake Equation Estate is, and then we're going to look at some new data that we've collected to validate this equation that was originally developed in 2011. And a couple of key concepts to keep in mind as we jump into this. Let's just think about a basic definition of salinity, because that's what the equation estate is all about. It's the total concentration of all dissolved salts in water. That's the very basic definition. Let's not make it more complicated than that. It can get really complicated because researchers over the years have kind of tailored it to their various needs. But for us, it's the total concentration of dissolved solids in water. And then the second key concept to keep in mind is the salinity of lakes can be determined from the known composition of the lake or from measurements of some physical property, so like conductivity or density. And conductivity and density are cheap measurements. They're generally easy to make. So this is a clue to a way to compute salinity values for Great Salt Lake relatively inexpensively. And this is a quote from Malero in 2000. This is the gentleman that helped develop the original Great Salt Lake Equation Estate with our very own Dr. Dave Naffs. So just a quick word on how we computed salinity in the past for Great Salt Lake, and it took advantage of that same concept where you can use conductivity or density to compute salinity. So historically, we used a hydrometer to measure the specific gravity of Great Salt Lake water. And then with the equations shown on the screen, we would use that specific gravity measurement to compute a salinity value. Now, this equation has never been evaluated in detail for how accurate it is for Great Salt Lake water. It's a generic equation, a set of equations, and we believe they were picked from the CRC Handbook of Chemistry and Physics. It's been used for years and years and decades. So Dave Nass, when he started working on Great Salt Lake, he recognized we needed something specific to the lake because it's such a unique system, and maybe a generic set of equations is not really the way to go. And a note here, the historic salinity calculation method is still being used at our long-term lake elevation gauges. And that's because we have such a long record using this method. On the southern half of the lake, we're using actually this historic equation and the Great Salt Lake equation of state. So at the end of the presentation, asked me to show you how those compare. But anyway, just for those who are USGS INWIS database nerds, the parameter code for the hydrometer specific gravity measurement is shown there, 72013, and the parameter code for the salinity value computed with these generic sets of equations is 00480. And like I said, that record dates back to the 1970s. So recognizing this wasn't specific to the, oh, let me just point out too. So the picture on the right, so that's an individual doing something rather dangerous working on that gauge, in my opinion. Note they've got a ladder extended way too high. We now rent scaffolding. Yeah, no, this is not OSHA approved. I debated whether or not to put this picture in here. But this was adaptive management that day to do something to that gauge. So the water surface elevation, this was September of 2018, was 4192.4. So this is our long-term gauge at Great Salt Lake Marina. This is the one that is associated with that record going all the way back to 1847. That gauge, as of September 29th, looked like, well, conditions at the gauge look like this. And if you see the radar at the top of the screen, that's what's actually making the measurement of the water surface. And you see mud down below. So we discontinued data collection at this gauge. And when you go to our INWIS webpage, there's text that will direct you to a substitute gauge that's located on the south half of the lake. It's just south of the railroad causeway. So we continue to make measurements, lake elevation measurements on the southern half of the lake, but not with this gauge right now. Hopefully the lake recovers, and there's a dredging project I know that's in the works that might allow us to restart this gauge. Okay, so Dave Nass recognized we needed an equation specific to Great Salt Lake. So in 2011, he published a research article detailing the equation, and the equation in the red is it's the actual equation of state for the lake. Those two terms, rho and rho naught on the left, that's density of the Great Salt Lake sample. Rho naught is density of pure water. And then we have on the right side of the equation some constants, but we have variables S, which is salinity, and we have a variable T, which is temperature. So this is an elegant way to estimate salinity. We have density, we have temperature, and then we have a salinity variable here. This equation can be solved for salinity. So then all we have to do is make a salinity, or excuse me, a density measurement in the, at a specific temperature. For us, we always do these density measurements at 20 degrees C. And we plug in the density measurement and the temperature to compute the salinity. And that's proved to be very efficient. And we believe providing a very good computation of salinity for Great Salt Lake. So there's the reference if you are interested. We're not the only ones that think this equation is pretty elegant because it provides us this consistent measurement method for density of water samples. You know, the procedures to use a vibrating U-tube densitometer. There's documented calibration procedures, and we use the documented equation, the equation of state, to convert density to salinity. And we approach that salinity measurement using that salinometer in a manner that's consistent with seawater. So the Great Salt Lake Salinity Advisory Committee, or Council, along with USGS and others, agreed this would be a preferred method for computing a salinity value for Great Salt Lake. So this, all the methodology and the equation of state actually already solved for salinity for you, so you don't have to do the math, is published in this DNR open file report and available online. So now we have a well-documented approach for computing salinity for the southern half of Great Salt Lake. The Great Salt Lake equation of state is developed over a salinity range, the original equation, I should say, is developed over a salinity range 23 to 182 grams per liter. The Great Salt Lake Advisory Committee and the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council recognized the need to extend that salinity range of the equation of state. We have much higher salinities now in the south half of the lake. So the picture on the left just demonstrates kind of the range that the 2011 equation of state covers. We have temperature on the y-axis, salinity on the x-axis, salinity, the max salinity values out there around 180 grams per liter, 182 technically. The shaded, the coloring of the plot is a representation of density, or relative density. It's the density of the sample minus the density of pure water. So we need to extend the range of this equation if it's going to continue to be useful for us as we reach these higher salinity values in the southern half of the lake. And I do want to specify this lake is specific to the southern half. Northern half of the lake, as we all know, higher salinity, and this equation's not been fully tested for the northern half of the water, or the water body. Okay, so recently then, we set out to collect some samples that have higher salinity than what were used to develop the original equation. So there's a map on the left showing the sample locations. So we hit 12 sample locations. We had 18 samples total. Shallow and deep samples were collected at sites with a deep brine layer. And then you see the range of sample dates there. We started sampling in June of 2021 and just wrapped up some sampling in March of 2022. And those old culvert locations, as well as the breach, are representative of North Arm water. The culvert locations, those samples were from the north side of the railroad causeway. So, briefly, methods for density. Well, we duplicated the methodology that NAF's published and the methodology that's in the UGS open file report. We measured density with an Anton Par 35 DMA EX. That's the most recent model of their long-standing vibrating YouTube density instrument. We used a water bath to control the temperature of samples. And so we measured the density of samples from a range of 5 to 50 degrees C. There's a picture of our very own Hannah McIlwain measuring density for samples for this study. And she's doing the bulk of the work on this study, by the way, and doing a great job for us. Then salinity, same thing. We duplicated the methodology used by NAF. So we have salinity measured with a guideline salinometer at the University of Miami's Rosenthal School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. This is Dr. Malero's lab. He's now emeritus status, but his protege runs that lab. So we have the same group of people, experts, measuring salinity for us. So they used a salinometer. It was calibrated with standard seawater. They diluted GSL samples down to the range of the calibration for the salinometer to get accurate measurements. And they measured the samples at around 20 degrees C. So here I'm showing a plot of density and temperature that were measured by USGS and with our Anton Par densiometer. So we have density in kilograms per meter, cubic meter on the y-axis, temperature in Kelvin on the x-axis for the various samples locations that are shown below. And the key takeaways from this plot are there's no obvious outliers. We think the densiometer that we use performed pretty well. Density responses were similar for the various samples collected from the lake. And then I just want to point out the shaded area on this plot. This represents an extended density range exceeding what was done originally to develop the equation of state. So we have lots of new information here to test that equation of state against. Here's the results of the salinity measurements made by the University of Miami. So we have actually a relative density on the y-axis and then the measured salinity. And again, these measurements were made at approximately 20 degrees C. The measurements look quite linear as we increase density or relative density. There's really no super obvious outliers on this data. There is some scatter, but overall the data look decent. And the shaded area again on this plot, this indicates salinity ranges that exceeded the original data set used to develop the Great Salt Lake equation of state. So we've got lots of new information here to evaluate our existing equation of state. And then one thing I just wanted to point out, it's not totally roses. You know, you saw on the previous slide there may have been a few data points that were falling off of the best fit line, suggesting not complete linearity. This plot is another way to show that. I have relative density on the y-axis here and measured salinity on the x-axis. And so the salinity values come from the salinometer, but for each sample, the relative density values, or just think of it as density, these are density values measured over the temperature range shown on the legend on the right. And some of the data, and the solid lines going through the data points are best fit, linear best fit lines at the various temperatures the measurements were done. And so some of the data fall off these regression lines a little bit, you know. And so the West Culvert sample is one of the samples that appears to kind of fall off the trend that the other samples are showing. The Farmington Bay outflow sample seems to fall off slightly. And we're looking into this, but I mean, the equation of state depends on some consistent ratios of ions dissolved in solution in order for it to work. Well, maybe Farmington Bay outflow, you can imagine we have some fresh water coming in and mixing with Great Salt Lake water. The fresh water coming in has a different chemistry. It's not a sodium chloride water necessarily. And so that's kind of changing the composition of the water. And you can imagine that might impact the density measurements. And therefore maybe not match up with the equation of state precisely. The West Culvert sample, that's a mystery right now. It could be maybe we blew the density measurements, but we're looking into that a little bit. I'll just say one thing we do know happens is when Bear River water comes into the lake, at times it can tend to come in and track along the railroad causeway and then make its way to the new breach. And I'm not sure what happens after that, how it spreads around, but maybe a little bit of Bear River water made it over to this West Culvert area. Not sure, that's a total conjecture on my part. Overall, this data looked quite good. And you should be thinking, well, things are kind of lining up. And the existing equation of state, these data are lining up to potentially show that the existing equation of state is pretty darn good, even at these elevated density and salinity values. And that's basically the take-home message of this presentation. We believe that the existing equation of state developed in 2011 does accurately predict salinity of samples collected. It did so for the samples collected for this study. Again, I'll say this is essentially specific to the South Arm. The plot I'm showing Great Salt Lake equation of state salinity values computed at 20 degrees C. So we took the density value at 20 degrees C, plugged it into the Great Salt Lake equation of state, and calculated a salinity. And then we compared that to the measured salinity. So that's the scale on the x-axis. So that's salinity measured by the salinometer at University of Miami. So basically, we used the equation of state to calculate a salinity for this new set of samples, compared it to the salinity values that the University of Miami measured. And you see for the data points on this plot, they line up along a 1-to-1 line, which is a perfect relationship between equation of state salinity values and measured salinity. The dashed lines on this plot on either side of the 1-to-1 line represent plus or minus 5%. So you can see most of our samples, in fact, all the samples fall within 5%. So we believe the equation of state is robust and can still be used even at these higher salinity values in the south arm. We're going to publish all the data for this study in a science-based data release, and then an analysis of the results, a more detailed analysis of these results are going into a journal article that is going to include more than just this equation of state information. It's going to include an in-depth analysis of salinity over the last decade or so. This is something Christine Rumsey is heading up. Hannah McIlwain's helping her. Scott Heenick is a part of the team as well. So this is going to be published, is the bottom line. And then the dashed lines here on the graph. So I'm just showing the original max extent for the Great Salt Lake equation of state in terms of salinity and density. And then the dashed line at the top of the plot represents kind of handled just fine by the Great Salt Lake equation of state. So we think we validated the equation of state over an extended range of salinity values. And just a quick plug for the Great Salt Lake Hydromapper. This was a product the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council helped fund. And we are putting salinity data on that product. You can't see this plot, I realize, very well, but the top time series plot is showing salinity values computed with the equation of state. The faint, I need glasses, I think it's a green, not the black line, is for a site GSL 3510. And then the black line that kind of traces along that towards the right of the plot, that's salinity measured at, you can't tell from where you're sitting, but salinity measured at GSL 3510 and salinity measured at our long-term gauge in the Great Salt Lake Marina, they line up quite well, trend quite well. So this is just one area where you can get at the salinity data. And I have the parameter code for both the Anton Parr density measurement that we make and the equation of state salinity value there for you. So if you're an INWIS nerd, you know what the parameter codes are for those two values. That's all I've got.
If not, thank you very much. We
Oh,
appreciate it.
Leland, I think there is a question. Oh, no, someone just left the meeting.
Did I put everyone to sleep?
No one.
Sorry,
Okay,
my bad.
thank you very
So,
much.
Ryan,
Yes.
I'm Krishna.
Hey,
And
Krishna. When were they taken?
yes,
They were taken over a period of time. You can see down lower right on this slide that I brought up. Open water samples and Farmington Bay were June, July 2021. The breach.
no, I think basically I was interested with the one graph with the plot, straight line, down.
Were for those sample locations shown on the map.
So my question basically was that taken in the, just the recently or long time that represents the, different lake levels and the dilution? That was my.
Yeah, 2021 and March 2022 and get it fixed. But yeah, the salinity values were measured later by the University of Miami. I don't know the exact dates. So I'm sorry. You can feel free to call me, Christian, and we can talk about this more.
Okay, so anyway, so my you said the lesson is the function of temperature.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
so you said 5% that I'm thinking you saw the 5% of the variability. Just I'm thinking that maybe, you know, the variability might be a little bit more based on the, you know, lake water levels or the volume of the lake. That was my just a curiosity.
I do want to just bring up with this plot that I'm showing right now. In the south arm of the lake, we have salinities around densities around 1.18, 1.19. And on this, you can see we have data points just shy of 1.22. So for the main body of the south arm, this equation is state, and those values that are just shy of 1.22 plot well, right? They're almost on that, basically on that one-to-one line. So we're talking about north arm water, basically. So.
Any other questions? If not, thanks very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
And we're going to really remember that formula. We now have a presentation on water rights in the Great Salt Lake by Blake Bingham. Thank you very much.
Appreciate the opportunity to present. I did give most of the you'll see today. I presented a little while back at the CLE conference, but happy to present this and talk about some of the considerations with regard to water rights as they relate to the Great Salt Lake. Let's kind of start off with only state engineers interested in following the statutory mandate. And so we looked to statute in 7321. We see that state engineers are responsible for the general administrative supervision. So how do those functions relate to the Great Salt Lake? Look at the general administrative supervision. We establish regional policies. We conduct cooperative studies to understand surface and groundwater flows and establish groundwater management plans around the lake. Measurement, obviously we're heavily engaged right now in implementing some recent funding as a result of House Bill 334 that gave us funds to go through new telemetry and measurement to help us better understand the flows and just some of the data gaps we have. And I think as we understand that data better, we're going to be able to manage the resource better. Appropriation, we have the application approval criteria in statute. In-stream flow change applications are a huge change to that. House Bill 330 use on sovereign lands can be used to benefit the Great Salt Lake or the Great Salt Lake levels, as well as split season and water banking change applications. And I'll talk a little bit more about those later on. Apportionment, and when we talk about apportionment, we're really talking about distribution models and reports. And then distribution, how do we shepherd water to the Great Salt Lake? So I got a chuckle out of this. Obviously, a couple of fictional characters. There are, and it reads, there are, of course, a number of real-world consequences associated with this, none of which there are a lot of real-world consequences that we do have to keep in mind as we look at some of these efforts to take water or bring water to the Great Salt Lake. And so I just want to touch lightly on a few of those. So first of all, I always want to talk about depletion because I think this is something that is not well understood. Flow chart just kind of help illustrate it. So I'm going to walk through it, so bear with me really quickly. Start off with the natural flow of a given river or system, right? And we will you'll divert that water and apply that water to this, this crop here, this meager little corn stalk I got going here. So that's what we call the applied irrigation. And I think this is what most of everyone intervening rights between the point of diversion and point of return flow. The plant, of course, takes that water up through its root zone and transpires it out. And that's how that water is consumed through plant and lost through transpiration. There's also another element that is just lost from evaporation, whether that's wind drift as well as some that may run off if you're doing surface irrigation, run off back. And those all return to the system, okay? And we call those return flows. And that helps make up rights, the water that go to satisfy rights further downstream or flows to the Great Salt Lake. But we also have another element, and that's just the natural precipitation that kind of goes into the balance. And as we look at depletion, when you hear the state engineer talk about depletion as it relates to irrigation, really what we're talking about are these two elements subtracting the effective precipitation. So you have, and then we take into consideration the average effective precipitation, which is in the Bob Hill study, it's the average precipitation multiplied by a factor of 0.8. And so we take the ET, we subtract the effective precipitation, and that's what we get the net irrigation requirements. And so when we talk about depletion as it relates to irrigation for crops, we're really talking about the net irrigation requirements. So go back to this. So why is this important? Well, I think it's important in the context of discussions for Great Salt Lake because we need to understand, well, the portion that is being reduced for diversion really should be going down to satisfy downstream rights. And so as we look at ag optimization and these efficiency measures, and we're trying to get more water to the Great Salt Lake, we probably ought to focus on reducing the depletion lever, right, as it relates to getting water to the Great Salt Lake, especially if we want to try to shepherd that down through some of the downstream users. And I'll give a little bit of an explanation of why that's the case here shortly. Available. So when we do change applications, we need to understand, hey, what are we really getting, okay? This is a hydrograph from the Spanish Fork River, and I've gotten rid of the strawberry and CUP water. So this is just kind of a natural hydrograph. And it's kind of hard, it may be hard to see, but I got a couple lines on there. And those lines represent thresholds that are associated with decree awards or classes of water rights. So everything below the red line, that's a first class right. And then as you kind of get above the red line, that means second class gets in priority. Able to get water really from April through July in this hydrograph, generally speaking. So the state engineer needs to keep that in mind. So here's a table that kind of reflects that. You got the different classes of water. You see the stage of the Spanish Fork River when those rights are available, and then the historical period of available flow, and the number of days that are associated for irrigation season. And then we kind of extrapolate that and get, all right, here's a prorated irrigation duty. So you can see the first class would get its full duty, second class. Take this hydrograph and we apply it to the consumptive use tables. We look at the period of use, and I'm just going to use second class as an example here. The period of use of second class, beginning of April through beginning of July. We correlate that on the consumptive use table and look at the April, May, June, July period, or excuse me, April, May, June period. We look at the net irrigation requirements. Remember, that's what we're talking about when we talk about depletion. Although you may have 1.72 acre feet of diversion, really you're going to be about a foot of depletion available for consideration if you're going to move that or change that along. So this is some of the analyses the state engineer does when we look at change applications, and they're highly relevant to when you look at water the Great Salt Lake because as we'll talk about, a lot of the water that will get to the Great Salt Lake is probably going to, if you're going to file a change, is probably going to be the depletion portion if you intend on shepherding. Diagram here, we have a farmer who does a deal and says, I want to file a change application, I want to get my water to the Great Salt Lake, and then however they decide to do the change application, we'll kind of leave that up in the air for the time being. So we have the little lamb, right? And we're going to try and shepherd this lamb past a bunch of hungry wolves who are eager to eat this lamb on its way down to the Great Salt Lake, right? And so the corporation, without a change application, without the application being papered, if the farmer were just to let that water go without a change application, there's nothing preventing legally these other diverters from taking that water. You know, these wolves, they've got to eat. They have livings too. So I'm not trying to demonize any of these other water uses just for the sake of the analogy, right? So we have our shepherd in chief here, Teresa Wilhelmsen. But we also have kind of a deputy shepherd in the form of a river commissioner. And so there's going to be these, from one point to another. It's important that it be on a distribution system because a distribution system means you have a commissioner who's actually got a hand on the head gate and can kind of see the water, see the slug of water, and make sure it gets where it needs to go. It's not necessarily critical, or it's not totally necessary, but it's highly critical, I think, in my opinion. We also need to know that this water is being released. We can monitor its slug of water as it goes on down to the Great Salt Lake. So that's critical again. And then finally, we need accounting models so that we know that those wolves who are downstream who have rights, that they're the shepherding of water, just so we know where the water has gone, who gets what, and how we can ensure that it gets where it needs to go. And then, of course, some little animation. All right. So let's talk a little bit about split season change applications. And this is something that's relatively new. State engineer hasn't, I don't know that we've done any of these yet, to be honest. None have come across my desk. But let's talk about some to get at least this crop off, and then I'm willing to send at least my other half of my water the remainder of the year. So it's just another tool in the bag to see if we can't make it easier for people to beneficially use their water in ways that is meaningful and lawful. So when we look at split season change applications, one thing we've got to look at is the crop coefficient. You know, the crops consume different amounts of water based on the state or attempts to file a split season change on. Well, we need to understand, all right, is it going to be early season, is it going to be mid-season, late season, what portion? And because that will affect the amount of water that's associated with at least the depletive portion and potentially also the diversion portion. Again, hydrologic availability comes into play. Obviously, generally speaking, rivers flow more abundantly each season. You tend to file a change that may affect the amount of water available for change. And then this is kind of something that is maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but a lot of these crops, especially alfalfa, have root systems that go, you know, feet down, right? And so if you apply water, that water continues to be buffer time to allow the consumption to take place before we allow the diversion on the other end of the split season change to begin, just to make sure we're not duplicating depletions. Again, all of those are hypothetical because we haven't really gone through the process, but these are some of the things we're talking about and have been talked about in the community. Let's talk about water banking, and this is another new tool, whatever will help water users beneficially use their water in as much as we can protect existing rights. And so when people hear about water bank, they kind of, I think the challenge is it oversimplifies it. You know, they think they can, they kind of imagine, hey, I'm just going to deposit this, and then I'm going to go to my water ATM, pull out some water bucks, and spend water bucks down at the Great Salt. And then I'm going to be able to withdraw this water later on, and everything's cool, and you know, it's going to work really easy. But the challenge with a water bank from the state engineer's perspective is the scenarios, once it's in the bank, how will that water be used? What are some of the scenarios that allow the bank to do those quick transactions, right? And so we've got all of these questions that come to our minds because we got to make sure that water right, war game, all these potential scenarios of how this water can be used in the bank to ensure that we're protecting existing rights from impairment, and we're not allowing water to be, rights to be enlarged or anything along those lines. So these are some of the questions we have, and as with anything new, it's always a little bit of a grind to do the first application, and we're in the midst of that right now. And we're working through that. And the state engineer is very concerned that we're protecting existing rights because once it goes in the bank, to some degree, it's kind of out of the state engineer's hands. Now the bank needs to administer that, and they're able to do that, you know, to the convenience of the water user, which is a good thing. But those are some of the considerations. And then you may have seen this at this summit. Really, all I want to present with this slide is the complexity and how the Great Salt Lake is the hub of all these spokes, the computer. It was my last slide anyways. So I'll kind of speak as Paul does this. This is magic. So to illustrate the complexity, you can see how those tentacles all kind of went down to the Great Salt Lake. We have a lot of storage. And one thing that, yeah, just go to the last slide, please. That'll work. Awesome. So let's see if I can do it without breaking the computer again. to be strings pulled elsewhere. And I think that's important. And one of the elements that I think is also important for people to recognize is that we have a lot of storage reservoirs upstream. And you can see if we emptied all those storage reservoirs, you know, if you say at full, they're about 3.6 million acre feet. Well, the Great Salt Lake at half full is 7 million acre. Expectation from maybe some of the lay people in the water community, like, hey, why don't we just send the water out of Jordanelle or do this or do that, and without recognizing how the scope of the Great Salt Lake, how big it is, how much water goes to it, and that even if we were to release Jordanelle, it would just make a very small dent in the overall elevation. And kind of navigating some of these complex issues in order to satisfy our statutory mandate, which is to provide order and certainty in the beneficial use of distribution and beneficial use of Utah's waters. And to that extent, we can do that and help stakeholders, whether they be mineral extractors, brine shrimpers, other environmental agencies or duck clubs. We are interested in doing that and facilitating.
Go ahead.
Go, Tom.
Laura? No. I'm going to throw in that then, Tom.
Thanks, Leland. I just had a question about the water right application that you are entertaining. Where is the location of that water right?
That's actually
Or water banking
down in the Price River.
That's what I thought. Thank you.
Thanks, Blake. Two questions. On your earlier chart, when you talk about evapotranspiration, circle pivot, and it's a windy day, and 30% of my water is just going off to Colorado, is that captured in that ET, or is it?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge because, so that would be captured in the evaporative portion in my mind. Now, whether the consumptive use table, that's based on flood irrigation. So it's not a perfect, precise, and obviously there's a lot of imprecision about it because on a bad year, if it's really dry, you're probably going to divert more because there's less precipitation, you're going to consume more. So to answer your questions, in theory, it's captured in the evaporative portion of the ET, but as far as the state engineer currently uses, we don't take into consideration different application methods when evaluating change applications at present. I know there's been a lot of bit more, and we're interested in preserving just a little bit more water. There may be some interest in doing that.
And maybe, so the second question, in my prior private consulting career, I did agricultural optimization in other states, and their water right framework allowed someone that was a separate party to come in, pay a farmer, do the investment, and then do a change application. And that saved water, they paid for that saved water. The farmer still has a system that produces the same amount of crops, in many cases far more efficient, but it produces new water. The pie gets bigger to agriculture. And so where I'm going with this is, from a water rights perspective, public policy and making water for the lake, capturing water that's lost to the atmosphere because a farmer's using a technology that's 20, 40, 50 years old. How does that get captured in this and then putting it to the lake? And I know there's the agricultural optimization committee and others that are working on this, but I think that's probably one of the biggest, that is the biggest opportunity for creating new water for Utah. And there's a lot of other questions that go from there. But.
Sure. Well, let me take a crack at it. So I don't think there's anything that prevents the state engineer from evaluating a change application that might look like that. I think to ensure that there is no expansion of the rights, there's probably going to be, and we've done challenge just statutorily. Now we've done this elsewhere where we said, well, you're going to file a change, you're going to change it to commercial, right? And now suddenly you have a commercial use. And in the case of, there's a farmer down in Imperial Enterprise who's done this and then expanded their acreage because they filed a change, said, hey, we're going to use acres. All right, well, now you're a commercial operation and you've got but they have some pretty intensive monitoring and measuring requirements to ensure they're not exceeding the depletion. And interestingly enough, so they have these the other farmers around them, so they're irrigating the same thing, but because they went through this change application and were limited by their depletion, and because we use this average ET and average precipitation, they got cut off early. So it was kind of, it's a two-sided double-edged sword. But back to your original question, I don't think the state engineer would be opposed to that. I think it's a burden on the applicant to demonstrate, yes, there's not going to expand the water right, and then we also need to understand what are the statutory limitations, and if it's, hey, I'm going to irrigate the same number of acres, well, we may need to look at that to have some creative solutions to overcome that.
Okay, maybe, but if we have a much more efficient system that crop, or maybe I change my crop, my beneficial use of water, I have a 5 acre-foot duty, and my depletion to the system, if I can reduce my depletion and still have some production on my land, maybe even better, it's creating new water for the system. So I just throw that out as something that really needs.
Totally understand it, and I sense, and I know the state engineer senses there's a desire to identify what that delta is.
Thanks, and thanks, Blake. Great presentation. Really just 2 comments just to kind of underline, I think, kind of what you were talking about a little bit, Tom, but just to help people understand the difference between what we call conservation or efficiency sometimes and depletion. I mean, the NRCS for decades has funded pivot sprinkling systems in the name of conservation, and I think it's important. It increases depletion as permitted by law, but it does that. Why? Because it not only does it more efficient, it's worse in the West, and it just shows. Again, on an individual producer level, it makes a ton of sense, depending on where you're at, to have, in the name of conservation, you got to be careful about what you did. And I just want to kind of to illustrate that. The second thing I just point out, Blake, is I think if you just look volumes of GSL and volumes of reservoir, I think it obscures a pretty important point, which is that what we're worried about with Great Salt Lake is how to stabilize those elevations, right? So nobody's proposing, for example, that we would drain all of our reservoirs and try to fill Great Salt Lake. But what we are talking about is how can we arrest the annual decline? And that delta is quite different than the total volume. Sure. And I just think by sharing that, you sort of get the, well, the reservoirs don't play a role couldn't play a role in saying, like, they actually really could, because the annual deficit is much, much smaller, probably 400,000 acre feet. I don't know, those numbers are debated, but bottom line is the number starts looking achievable when you talk about it in terms of 400,000 acre feet instead of 5 million acre feet or whatever.
Excellent points. Thanks for that clarification. Yeah, very important. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for anybody from online? Yes?
Krishna.
No?
Krishna has a question, looks like. Go ahead, Krishna.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for this great presentation. You presented very good, slide that shows the diversion, depletion and then the return flow, right? So state office is doing all the recording and observation of those components. So based on your observation and the data, what do you see about the trend? Are those going up or down, or what's your, if you have done some modeling or analysis, because so many studies are going and then they are saying the depletion is the main driver for the lake level going down. So what's your observation and then, some determination based on your data?
Yeah, great question, Krishna. So the Division of Water Resources has the model, the water budget model for the Great Salt Lake Basin. And what they have concluded, or at least in their model thus far, is in the contemporary period, which is the last 30 years, is that those depletions have remained relatively constant. They haven't increased much, even in the agricultural sector. So, and what you see maybe is a little bit of conversion from ag to municipal. But for the most part, they've been steady, and that's kind of a head scratcher. I think it's a little bit counterintuitive. I know the Great Salt Lake Strike team has looked at that and has concluded that man's use, human-caused impacts of the Great Salt Lake accounts for a big portion of the lake's deficit, but there's also other environmental factors, obviously drought, climate change, those types of things. and I think probably warrant further study. But as far as depletions go, current models suggest that depletions have remained relatively steady over the last 30 years. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for everyone and for the good questions. We are going to move along. We appreciate your time today. Thanks for that great presentation.
And I don't know how to exit out of the Mac, so maybe I just escape. Oh, there we go.
Paul will be appearing momentarily. Paul?
We have a request for some funding from Bear River Economic Study. Nathan?
Then if you just use the arrow keys or 2 fingers, you can go down. Okay, perfect, thanks. Okay, thanks, Leland. For those that don't know me, Nathan Dowgs, I'm the manager of Cache Water District. And a little over, I don't know, Laura, how much did they talk about this at last month's meeting? I know it was right at the end. I don't know how much Don presented.
33 seconds.
33 seconds, okay. So our district's only been around for a few years, but probably about 3 years ago, as your group started to really circulate the benefits of the Great Salt Lake study, we thought, well, we really ought to have something like this for the Bear River watershed. And at that time, we were really looking at Cache and Box Elder counties. And then as time went on, trying to find ways to fund it, get people to join the group of stakeholders that would do this project, it became a little more clear that we needed to look a little broader and as far as the region goes and include Idaho, and then reach out to other stakeholders that might be involved. And that really became apparent in the last 2 years as we've gone through this drought cycle and with the legislature. They see your study and they react to that, right? A number of bills focused on the Great Salt Lake, which is great, but we need to know what are some of those bills going to affect in the greater region, the Great Salt Lake watershed, mine being the Bear River one. And we think we need a similar study in every watershed. So as we look at these solutions, you know, Blake's one slide of that tangled web of how we shepherd water to the Great Salt Lake as we implement some of these bills that have been passed. What are we going to give up in watershed A to help watershed B? And it's a give and take, right? We're going to have to give something up, whether that's releasing water from the reservoirs and not having the water supply that Weber Basin relies on to provide drinking water, or whether we give up some production in agriculture in a different watershed. It's all going to be tied together, and so I don't see it as a Save the Great Salt Lake issue. I see it as a northern Utah water issue, right? It's going to affect all of us one way or another. Unless we can get a storm to park on the Great Salt Lake and rain for 6 months and fill it up, which isn't going to happen, we've all got to work together. And so we see this study is going to go hand in hand with your study when we go to the legislature and say, we need funding for a project in Cache County so that we can have water available. Maybe just what you're talking about there. We can do some ag optimization that will make new water available. It's not really new water, but it saves that water. And then we need those tools in place to get that through the watershed. Because right now, if we have a farmer or a canal company in Cache County that wants to send 1,000 acre feet to the Great Salt Lake, we have the bill there to do it, but we don't have the infrastructure. I guarantee you we're not going to get that water through all the other diversions and get it there today. So I think this study, for me, it's the first step in building that partnership between the canal companies, the cities and counties, the environmental groups we're working with the Nature Conservancy on this, and more importantly, across state lines. The Bear is the biggest contributor to the lake, but we're only talking about it, and Blake only talks about it because, right, your water right authority stops at the border. But a couple of very large water rights in Cache County are Idaho water rights. And then you have all the irrigated ground in Idaho too. If you go to Grace, people don't talk about the Great Salt Lake. They don't care. But this, I think this is the first step in getting them to care. If we can show, look, there's a huge benefit to the Bear River watershed, and what adjustments can we make in those benefits up there to benefit downstream water users, or ultimately the Great Salt Lake. And so that's why we're doing this study. That's why we came to the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, because we think it's critical to have you guys on board and your support for the study to be able to see how that, sorry, I didn't touch it long enough. Most of them have seen this. We sent it out a little over a month ago to the council, the members. So that's really why we're doing it. We've got an estimate. We think the study's going to cost somewhere around $150,000 plus. Division of Water Resources has offered a grant for $50,000 of that. So we've got Cache Water District putting up a minimum of $25,000, but whatever gap is left, we will fill that. Bear River Water Conservancy District, the 3 Northern Utah Soil and Water Conservation Districts have all put money into it. We're still working with Nature Conservancy. Ann hasn't finalized how much they might be able to put towards that. We're working with the Idaho Association of Conservation Districts, and then the Bear River Association of Governments and the Southern Idaho Association of Governments. So there'll be 7 counties involved, 3 in Utah, 4 in Idaho. So a pretty diverse group of stakeholders that will work with us through the next year plus to get this study done, and hopefully have a similar study to what was done on the Great Salt Lake. And we think, if we could get one done on the Weber River, the Provo River, the Ogden, it would be the Great Salt Lake benefit is $1.5 billion. It might be the Great Salt Lake watershed is $5 billion. And so how do all those things interact together as we look for solutions to all our water supply needs, not just one and all of them. So that's really why we're here, to request some funding from you, Don, and said you guys had a little money left over in this year's project funding, so he said it would be worth coming to ask for it, because he thought it seemed like a good fit. But it's ultimately up to you guys. So I'm happy to take any questions on it. If there's more out there.
Two comments or questions or recommendations. One is, in the economic analysis, it would be good for the economic analysis that's been done on the Great Salt Lake to be incorporated in there, so that it's not just the production analysis for the economic benefit, the $1.3 billion that we looked at before, but also the loss of the lake's economic impact that it will incur because of its not being there.
Yeah.
So we've talked about that, and that's a substantially additional amount of money. And so that balance has to be incorporated into the study to look at how that plays off against an economic gain, perhaps, by use of water upstream.
Yeah, and we've talked about that already, having that. And not only that, the loss of production upstream, they're going to be counteractive. And so I think that is even a more in-depth study, and we can put some of that in here. But I think to get to that level, we might need more money. So if you've got more money, we're happy to take it.
Well, we don't.
But we've already talked about how that's going to interact with each other. It's giving up one for the other. If one disappears, there's an economic loss to that's got to be accounted for.
Okay, I would prefer that somewhere in this study, it's going to reference the work that's been done.
Yeah.
Whether it's incorporated in as a trade-off or whether it's a reference to it. I think that your study needs to highlight that those studies have also been done, and they are part of the equation when we look at that water. And the second item would be if you guys are willing to have someone who represents the Great Salt Lake on your stakeholder steering committee.
Yeah, we would hope someone from your group would be on that steering committee.
Well, we would probably nominate Laura because she's wonderful.
I assumed you would, but yeah, we would be happy to have someone from the group on the steering committee.
Go ahead, Tim.
So Nathan, I appreciate the presentation, but I'm struggling a little bit to wrap my head around it from the perspective of this group with its GSL focus funding that study. I'll just say
or a portion of it.
So, funding a portion of that. And the reason why is that you referenced some of the stuff Blake talked about, which is sort of infrastructure, water rights. That's not the study. This is an economic study. Yeah. And so presumably what that economic study is going to show, and I can certainly see the value from the benefit of the Conservancy District, to figure out, well, what's the economic value of that water held upstream in Bear Lake or used in farms in rich Box Elder County, all that stuff. I can see it, but I can only see that information being used at the end of the day to say why you shouldn't send water downstream. Like fundamentally, it doesn't seem, other than giving, a weapon for lack of a better word, to hold on to that water, to sort of say, well, there's economics here and there's economics there. Like how does this fundamentally help the lake? This group has done extensive studies on the economic value of Great Salt Lake. It did an initial study, did a revised study to quantify that. But I'm not sure how understanding that broader economics helps this group accomplish its mission.
I would say, and I guess I said it a little there, maybe not well enough. I think without that information, right, the stuff that, I think if we don't have it, we do just fight against each other. If we can come together and say, look, we're working together on these solutions, we have to know, yeah, right now, if you go to Cache County or any of the farmers upstream or water users, they want to hold on to every drop, right? Because they see in the news every day, what do they hear? The Great Salt Lake's disappearing, it needs more water, right? And so we can do our study separate and stay on separate teams and fight and fight and fight, or we can say, we've got to come together and work on this as one huge group. Because yeah, and that's why I came here, because I think having you guys on board, having a member of your commission on this steering committee, so that those things are noted, that this study's already been done on the Great Salt Lake. We know we need to get water down there because of that benefit, and not just the economic, but the health reasons that might be associated with that. Which, you know, in Cache County, we might get some of those health, you know, not benefits, but detriments if the lake disappears. Not as much as the Wasatch Front. So I see it as getting in the same sandbox and playing together, and not saying these are my Tonka toys in my sandbox. I don't care about your sandbox. And so I see your point, you know, and there'll be people on my board that have that same sentiment, that we don't want to work together. But my point is, we have to work together. You know, that's why I'm asking for a smaller amount of funding from you, not 50% of the study, because it's not primarily to benefit you, but I think there are benefits there to this group long term that starting this footwork of looking outside of our little box and the whole watershed of how we do that. Because if we go to the legislature to fund bills that are gonna solve the problems, we want everybody on board with those bills. How do we implement them? You know, in Cache County to get water down there, we need everybody on the same page, because a lot of the canal company meetings I go to now, they say, well, that in-stream flow bill is to take our water. Well, no, it's not. It's a tool that we can use to benefit you as a farmer and also benefit the Great Salt Lake. But they don't see it that way because we're not working together enough on the solutions yet. So that would be, I don't know if that gives you enough of a reason to think it's a good study or not, but that, I think we've all got to work together, whether we're somewhat enemies or not. We've got to get together on these solutions, or you know, the lake's going to continue to go down. You know, you look at the amount of water it needs. You said the deficit of 400,000 or 500,000 acre feet to kind of keep it level. You know, that's all the water that gets diverted in Cache and Box Elder counties on a year. So we would give, you know, and that's just, we wouldn't do it all, but we don't really have the reservoir storage other than a little bit in Bear Lake. Our other reservoirs are so small that they give you like 2 days worth of evaporation if we empty them. And so it's a broader scale than what do we have in those reservoirs. We got to do it on a whole landscape issue to get water to flow.
I appreciate that, and I just say I think and I wholly agree, right? I mean, look, it's a huge system, and if people don't work together, there's no way you can solve some of these complex problems. I guess I still just question whether this particular study, which is an economic study that's looking just at those upstream uses, it's still just hard for me to see why that benefits this group and why we wouldn't use the very, you know, scarce resources that this group has to continue to work on a lake that is on the brink of, you know, ecologic disaster.
Yeah, and it's I mean, a fair question with your limited funds. And I think it's the
Tom
first,
had a
hopefully the first
question.
of many studies we do to get more detail of what we need down the road.
Tom had a question.
Thanks, Lee. And I share Tim's concern, but I really like your response, Nathan. And I'll go back to my working for a large firm in the North Pacific Northwest. What I don't see in your scope, but I heard you describe, is this: that if we look beyond just the Great Salt Lake and don't look beyond the headwaters as it comes in, or if we just look at the headwaters on the Weber and don't look down, we're going to overlook impacts and we're going to overlook opportunities. And if we, go through that process, we'll look back 30 years from now and say, crap, we missed an opportunity, or we overlooked an impact. And your point's well taken. I think, if we can come on the same page and seize those and move forward. So what I would suggest is, something that, as I read the scope, it doesn't have that narrative in your response to Tim, that it says that this study will identify the opportunities for saving water and, not in lieu of, and enhancing the economic viability and health of the Weber watershed. The example I'll go back to again when I did this study, this project, this was for a private, agribusiness giant farm in the Palouse. Our job was they were mining the aquifer, the groundwater was dropping 40 feet per year. So that wasn't sustainable. When we got done, we took the circle pivots and we got we had them unskated where they were only running when it wasn't windy, changed them out with modern technology. And I know USU's got more technology that can save water, right? And so we cut back their water use by 30%. When the client came back to us, they said, well, that's really great, but you know what? Actually, we got our power costs. We're saving 7 figures on our power costs now because we're not pumping water that's getting wasted and going to the atmosphere. Our fertilizer costs, those have gone down by 20%. Our herbicides have gone down, and our runoff management. So they got 4 times the benefit out of what they thought was just a water, they're running out of water. So I would say I would be in support of this if there's a specific, series of bullets of what you described, Nathan, where it identifies those opportunities where we change, modernize, invest in modernization, or maybe even changing crops, or what are the opportunities that the farmers in the community up there can look at that will generate water for the lake? If that could be included, that sentence, I think it does what you described. It brings us together to say, hey, if we don't expand our view, we're adversaries. But if we expand our view, we're partners.
Yeah, and this was a first take. We were hoping to get all the stakeholders together and then, rewrite this purpose here. Laura Gale with Bragg, she's online. She couldn't make it down here. This was kind of her first draft at it. But yeah, if you guys put into it and Laura's on that committee,
and I think to close, I think the win would be where, again, I had the same concerns that Tim did at first and had a conversation with Leland beforehand. If this can help us all see beyond where we're playing defense, that the bigger game we can all win, it'd be a really good study. And like you said, it could help then transporting that to other basins. Thanks.
Leland, there's a question online, or 2 questions online now.
Go ahead, Joe.
Hi, everybody. Tom, I completely agree with what you just stated. We've expanded our view over the past 5-7 years tremendously to be more of a watershed view as opposed to just a what's below the meander line view. So I really do like the suggestion you gave, Tom, and if we're looking at the hydrology of the basin, I think it's intuitive to look at other facets, including economy, within the basin as well.
Thanks. And our other question was from Trevor.
Yeah, so this is more of a comment. So I haven't had a chance to talk with Mr. Dowgs, but Bear River Canal Company will also be contributing to this study. And we hope that the GSL Council understands that, Bear River Canal Company is a large agricultural producer, or a large agricultural player, I should say, in the Bear River Basin, the largest contributor to the lake. And we also have unique relationships with the upstream irrigation companies, particularly in Idaho. And that's where a lot of the water from the Bear that's currently being used is by agriculture in those 2 states. And Idaho can be a little bit difficult to work with in solving this macro Great Salt Lake issue, because they have certain allowances under the current Bear River Compact that we as Utahns have no control over. But we do have some influence there. So we feel that this study is imperative for us working in the space in conjunction with the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council and those concerned with the lake on, our efforts in ag optimization. What is reasonable compensation for these water banks that we've talked about? What's the reasonable compensation for this saved water that agriculture is now getting its teeth into to take down to the lake. Without this economic analysis, we can't really put some numbers to that. When we initially talked with Nathan about this, we talked about looking at the some of the wet water benefits, maybe not so much the economic benefits, but we feel that you guys have done an excellent job, particularly with Representative Hawks's work on the HCR 10 studies on, talking about how we can move the wet water. There's just this economic component that's missing. And so, we see ourselves as a particular influencer on helping agriculture to help them to be part of the solution for the lake. And we see this as imperative. So we certainly would ask for your support in funding a small portion of this study so that we can get a handle on how we can work in the space. So thank you.
So, barring any other questions, I see 4 outcomes we got to be choosing on here. 1 is no thanks. 2 is go ahead. 3 is give us more detail to answer questions raised by Tim and Tom. And 4 is we'll approve it subject to those details being worked out, giving Laura the ability to say, I think it's there. So we can have any one of those 4 options available to us, but we need a motion to move forward with one of those options.
I would vote for option 3, Leland's, to review a revised proposal for future consideration and approval.
Okay, we have 1 on option 3. Do we have any other strong opinions? Tim, Tom?
Well, I wanted to check on like time schedule and stuff like that. Option 4, as I understood, is, having Laura be our eyes and ears to work with you and maybe some interaction, but you don't come back to this body for a vote per se. So I'm thinking option 3 or 4. Tim, do you have a sense?
Unless I'm mistaken, Leland, sort of the only difference between 3 and 4 is whether Laura's engaged.
Well, the difference is it doesn't come back to us. If Laura says it's good, she gets to go.
It wouldn't come back to us.
It won't come back. If Laura says
Joe,
no,
Joe's preference was come back
bring it
again.
back here.
Yeah. I just want to clarify that.
Well, I mean, assuming maybe we have a sub-working group with Laura, just so we all have different perspectives that I think are important.
And I'm sure Laura would love the opportunity of not being blamed to make a bad decision. Only.
I'd be happy to set up a meeting to review or revise scope, if you'd like. But the next advisory council meeting is January 11th, so it might be a bit from now.
Yeah. So we could do number 4 with a subgroup Laura can pull together of those who want to be involved to review and make sure the scope does comply with what we like.
That would be our preference if we can, just so we can keep things moving along.
That's fine.
Does that sound all right?
Is that
Do we
Joe's
have
motion?
a motion to that effect?
What was your motion, Joe?
So this would be a substitute motion.
I'm supportive of that. So I move to move forward with option 4.
So we got the option to give tentative approval subject to final approval being authorized by Laura to make that approval, subject to working with a smaller internal group. That's our motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second that motion.
Okay, Dina. We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you for your
Okay,
time.
thanks, guys.
We are at the point in the agenda where we're going to ask for public comments. Do we have any that want to make public comments? It's good because we have no more time in the meeting.
Oh, hand
Oh,
raised.
wait a minute.
Lisa Welsh, USU, I believe.
Lisa, did you have a comment?
Hi, I'm sorry. I know you're at the end of the tail end of your meeting. I just wanted to say hi and say I'm working with Joanna Interwada and Karen Kettering at USU on the survey about Great Salt Lake. So we're trying to understand the public's perspectives on the lake and also what people would be willing to do and support to help the lake. So I know Laura sent out the survey links and flyer last month. Thank you, Laura. But I wanted to remind everyone to please fill out the survey if you haven't done so already. And we would also appreciate you passing it on to anyone else who might be interested. We're trying to get as much participation as possible. So I'll write the survey link in the comment box and also my contact information if anyone has any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments? If not, we'll close the public comment period. We have a couple of items to finalize. One is there's a list of items on the agenda that talks about recommendations and actions. If anybody has any council items for further meetings, please bring those to Laura. If you have a suggestion right now, that would be fine also. Otherwise, we need to author or approve the 2023 meeting schedule. We have it proposed here. Second Wednesday at 10 a.m. on the following dates: January 11th, March 8th, May 10th, July 12th, September 13th, and November 8th. Go ahead.
Oh, I just have an item that I did want to bring to the council's attention. As part of our water quality 401 certification review of the U.S. Magnesium Canal Continuation Project, I think most people are aware of it. They're extending their canals into the lake to reach lower elevations. We've gotten some comments back. I should note first that we had a request to extend the public comment period. For your information, that will be open until November 14th. And then the other aspect of some of the comments that were received of interest from Friends of Great Salt Lake is to declare an emergency impairment or threatened status for the lake based on the ecologic condition of the lake right now and the high salinity levels due to declining water levels. We're taking all these comments seriously. We're going to be vetting this and scoping out that issue. The first step of that, we're going to be talking about this at tomorrow's Salinity Advisory Committee meeting and getting some initial feedback for that. So I just wanted to make that this group aware of that and see if that would be something on a future topic conversation at a future meeting.
Sure.
Sure.
Sure. Any other comments on suggestions on meetings? If not,
So, quick question. Is it the intent, Laura, to keep the hybrid option going on meetings?
I believe it's up to the council. I know Don's preference is definitely in person. So, but because of the day, he's, kept it open to both. But if the council has a strong feeling one way or the other, I think we could
I like
make
how
that
you
decision.
phrased it in the, where the preference is to be in person, but the online option, I know for myself and maybe others, it's made it, been able to attend when I otherwise wouldn't.
Yep. And we realize that now. I think with everyone's busy schedules, how convenient this virtual option is. So we're happy to keep doing it. I believe Don is happy to keep that going as well.
okay, so we still have the agenda for the schedule for the proposed meetings. If that's agreeable, either in person or online as the proposal, I would take a motion to that effect.
I'll make that motion.
Tom has made that motion to approve the agenda or the schedule for the meetings. Is there a second?
I'll second.
We have a second from Dina. All in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you. If there's no other items that people want to bring up, we are at the point where we can adjourn. So,
I do have a question.
okay.
I'm
Dina.
sorry. Is
Go ahead.
Lisa still on the line? Is she still with us? Lisa Welsh? Lisa, so the survey, this is a question I had when I got the survey before. There's no deadline on the survey document. So what's the deadline for, what's your,
Well, we would like it if people could try to fill out the survey by December 1st, if at all possible. That way we could try to get everything together before the legislative session, because we're hoping we can share some of the results of the survey to all the legislators.
okay, so, and this is something that's appropriate for the county, the Office of Regional Development to share on our social media?
Yes, we would love that. We're trying to get as many people as possible to complete the survey, so we would really appreciate you doing that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that agenda indulgence. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Leland, can I just say one thing about the meeting schedule?
Yes.
The next meeting will be here at the Utah Department of Natural Resources. I made a request to meet at the Farmington Bay Wildlife Education Center for all of these dates, but they are booked for January 11th and September 13th will be an alternate location. So All of the other meeting dates, March, May, July, November, will be at the Eccles Education Center. There you have that.
Okay, thank you.
So Laura, sorry again.
Go ahead.
Hey, you might want to see if the Zions Bank Technology Center might be available for that January or September meeting. Obviously, it's right next to the Jordan River, and it's incredible, smart. They have a very smart room. So they're ready for hybrid meetings, and it's a really great facility. Just a thought.
Thank
I'll
you.
send you the contact information for scheduling there.
That'd be great. Thank you.
And Mid-Valley makes it really convenient as well.
Thanks.
If not, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Second.
I'll make the motion.
I have a motion, and I heard a second too. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Aye.
Bye.